Well, for more from the United States this time, Benjamin Barber. He's the author of Jihad versus McWorld and Consumed, and he's a senior fellow at Demos, where he writes about public versus private freedoms, among other things. Benjamin, welcome back to Grit TV. It's been too long. Looking at this, it was perhaps not the first thing I thought, but it was right up there, McWorld in flames. I mean, is that putting it too simply?
Well, in fact, it's not just McWorld in flames, but it is a replay of Jihad versus McWorld, because as we look down the path, the chaotic path that's unfolding now in Cairo and possibly in other countries, what we are seeing is forces of McWorld commercial capitalism pushed by the United States and Western Europe unraveling, even as long dormant and repressed Islamicist factions are beginning to reassert themselves, not directly today on the street. We know the street is young people, unemployed people, often secular people, but the real question is underlying that, these two sets of forces, Western capitalism, which isn't going to give up without a fight. It's not just when Mubarak goes, Western capitalism is not going to disappear, and the forces of Islamicism that see this as a golden opportunity, and they've taken their time to reassert themselves. And for example, on Saturday, they've called already a demonstration in Damascus. There is no equivalent of the secular masses that are on the street in Cairo. And there, if there is a demonstration and it's not repressed, you will see a much more Islamicist demonstration.
So I just want you to clarify that, because all week people have been saying this is not the Islamic Brotherhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're not saying it is that, but you are saying there is a culture clash here.
Yes, one of the problems with the Middle Eastern dictatorships is that when these regimes, and your previous guest just made this very clear, hollow out the institutions that are otherwise part of civil society in the West, they leave no alternatives. So if and when they fall, finding an organized institutional alternative capable not just of bottom-up street demonstrations, but of top-down rule, institutional rule, bureaucratic rule, there's very little there. The people who are there in waiting, who have something of that infrastructure, are in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, in other countries, the Islamicist groups. So they are organized in a way that, though while they've been low profile now, if Mubarak disappears, they will become much more high
So the
profile.
moment for truly creating that civil society may be very short, may be very brief. Before we go back to that, let me ask you about the role of the other subject that you've written so much about, and that's consumerism. My friend Ed Schultz, on whose program I'm often a guest, to be clear, did what I thought was an excellent report last night on MSNBC about the role of grain speculators in hiking the price of food. Take a look.
The UN estimates speculators held 65% of corn futures contracts, 68% of soybean, 80% of wheat. By mid-2008, the IMF food price index jumped more than 80% in just a year and a half before. We don't notice price hikes so much because most of our food prices come from marketing and packaging. But in the developing world, the price of food is everything. And what country imports more wheat than any other? Egypt, where the price of wheat rose 70% last year.
Benjamin Barber.
Well, yes, exporting American foodstuffs, wheat, grain, is going to drive prices up in places where they ought to be doing it themselves. There's been stories from all over Africa of locally grown grain being non-competitive with grain being pushed in from the outside. So that undoubtedly makes an important contribution. Consumerism is the leading edge of capitalism. We think of the banks and so on, but in fact, consumer goods, and that can be agricultural goods, it can be manufactured goods, actually drive capitalism in this part of the world and contribute mightily to the problem. But the issue here is, can they have civil society institutions, NGOs that are capable of occupying a middle ground between, on the one hand, the army, the old governmental bureaucracy that's been hollowed out, and the new dangerous institutions on the Islamicist right that are there to fill in when the streets become quiet again and someone's actually got to do the governing. And the problem is civil society is supposed to develop slowly over time, and there's been no attempt at doing that, or put it otherwise, the Mubarak government has repressed all such attempts.
Well, let's talk about civil society. I mean, in a civil society, you've written about this, and you gave an interesting speech to the APAP conference of presenting artists recently. And you made the point that there are private freedoms and there are public freedoms. And a real civil society relies on the preservation of public freedoms, which is more than just the freedom to
Well, I'm glad you
choose this or
brought that
that
up,
food.
Laura. And we don't have a lot of time, but it's a complex but very important thing if you look at what happens on the streets today of Cairo. Because right now, people are not demanding just private freedoms. They are not just saying, leave us alone, uncensor us, let us do our thing, give us jobs. They are saying, we have a right to be a public in common and to govern ourselves in common. And to do that, as we know in American democracy, de Tocqueville taught us this long ago, you need a civic infrastructure, you need civil institutions, you need NGOs, you need foundations and hospitals and philanthropies which create a substructure and infrastructure of participatory institutions on which responsible citizenship is built. That's what's missing in Damascus. That's what's missing in Tripoli. That's what's missing in Amman. That's what's missing in Cairo. And the places that I think have the best chance, oddly, are places like Libya and Syria, where there has been some attempt in recent years to begin to develop, off the radar, civil society institutions of a sort that could, in a transition, provide some leadership of a kind that right now is missing in Cairo.
I've got to play you a clip from U.S. media just for the sheer horror of it while we talk about civil society. Here's, well, Hannity and Ann Coulter. Take a look.
I am unaware of any democratic revolution that has taken place in an Arab country. And so my skepticism is that we're going to see the Muslim Brotherhood, El Baradei, or some type of extremist, as bad as Mubarak is, some type of extremist element take over in Egypt. Do you share my suspicion?
I could not agree with you more, and I'm glad you said that. I won't, like half the people on TV, pretend I've been an expert on Egypt all this time, but I am a bit of an expert on mobs. A mob like this, with no women. I've watched 18 hours of this. I've looked at the photos. That maybe they can produce a woman something good coming out.
I see some women right there on the screen, so there's some, but
Now, a lot of what we just saw is total nonsense, but I want you to address the right's raising of an alarm about Islamism and how it's different from the alarm I'm hearing from you.
A quip and an important point. The quip is that a mob is a group of democratic citizens in the street who are rebelling against your interests. And that's, of course, for Hannity and Coulter, what they talk about when they see a mob. But, you know, you can talk about a mob in 1776, the Boston Tea Party, which is much heralded by our Tea Party today. Revolutions do start in the streets. And they always start with impassioned and ardent people who have lost their rights, are demanding their rights. And there is, however, and this is the important point that you're also making, of course there is always a danger. We saw an Algerian revolution a dozen years ago that resulted in the destruction of the middle class, the destruction of professionals, and today an extremely dangerous regime. On the other hand, in Turkey, which they don't want to talk about at Hannity and Ann Coulter, we see a regime which has gradually moved from a nationalist secular regime to a moderate Islamicist regime, and has become a leader, a mediating leader, a moderate leader in the whole Arab world. It's Turkish, not Arab, but it's reasserted itself because it has made democracy work. It has made party government work. Bangladesh, by the way, is a Muslim democracy for their
And there are many models of change coming of not quite the sort that those who started it had in mind. I was in East Germany when the wall fell, and they did not have in mind being taken over immediately by a very capitalist Western Germany. They were kind of keen on creating a healthier, kinder, gentler socialism, but be that as it may.
Well, that's right. The one predictable things about revolution is that they are unpredictable. And every time we think we know where they're going, they go somewhere else. And in the piece I wrote for the Huffington Post yesterday, I emphasized the fact that it will look different in each country with a different history, a different culture. A different history means a different destiny, a different democratic or non-democratic destiny. Some of these countries will achieve democracy, others will achieve only reaction and renewed oppression. That is in the nature of things, but the United States does have an opportunity to influence events.
Well, that's my question, does it? I mean, everybody in Cairo, I think, knows that the U.S. has played a big role, not in supporting the democracy that they talk about there so much as shoring up Mubarak and, in fact, working with his secret police, as we found out from the WikiLeaks.
Call
tables.
it the American revolutionary paradox. We are the first modern democratic nation born of revolution. We have revolution in our bones. Even the Tea Party, like it or don't like it, has a bit of a feeling of the streets and get out there and take out,
But
take
does
after
the
the
US
guys.
have any
We have
credibility?
this in our blood. But then when we do our politics, we're always on the other side. Every time we've been on the other side. We were on the other side with the Shah of Iran. We were on the other side in Nicaragua and in Latin America and in Chile. We've been on the wrong side every side, and that's because it's not the blood of revolution that is in our bones and veins that is running through this government, but unfortunately the blood of capitalism. And capitalism and commercialism have been more or less steering foreign policy and shoving aside what comes natural to America, which is empathy for revolution, for freedom, and for people taking their own destinies.
So does the U.S. have any standing, and do we, the people, have any power to help civil society grow in Egypt?
It has no standing because it has not represented the voice deeply embedded in our history. We as American citizens can go back to government and say, get on the right side. Stop being so cautious. I mean, this deal of, gee, do we abandon Mubarak quickly because maybe he's going to stick around or not? Doesn't matter. We should be on the right side and take our chances. We're always on the wrong side of a history that we ourselves helped make revolutionary.
And maybe we could help their civil society by building our own.
By building our own and by helping them build theirs. There are programs in a number of Arab countries focused on civil society, and those are the most exciting for the future of democracy.
All right, Benjamin Barber, you can get his books and find out more at our website, grittv.org.